John, thanks so much for joining me. Getting to interview you is very special for me because it takes me back to the earliest stages of my career where I was working for Chuck Colson and helping him produce some of his media and social media. I remember he was so excited when I told him how many people had gone to our website because Google Analytics had just come out, and I was like the kid with the cool tools, you know. It's like I had all these like new fangled gadgets, and now I think of how archaic some of the stuff was that we were using at the time.
He was probably still using the fax machine at that point, right?
Oh, I mean, yes, yeah. And but you were very involved in his ministry then, and you know, obviously you run the Colson Center for Christian Worldview now, and are you know running Breakpoint. But I think back to that time. But then I also can't help but think, what would Chuck's comment be today? We were doing the 2-minute warning video series every week. He did 2 minutes on what do you need to know right now. If you were to channel Chuck for a moment, what would you think? What would his 2-minute warning be today?
I told you so. You know, we've joked. I mean, honestly, you know, Emily Colson, his daughter, is still on our board, and you know, we talked about this a little bit, where he foresaw kind of the inevitability that are part of just kind of when certain ideas become possible, other ideas become inevitable. And or certain realities become inevitable, and he foresaw so many of those things. I mean, you think about kind of the Manhattan Declaration, right? The statement put out in 2009 that he really led along with Robbie George and Timothy George on life, marriage, and religious liberty. And we had so many interesting conversations back then about how, you know, the challenges on life and the challenges on marriage were really going to challenge the freedom of conscience. And a lot of people didn't see that connection in the way that he did. And of course, he turned out to be exactly right. And then where that would then lead. We also have talked about the fact that God's really kind, because in his timing, took Chuck home, and you know, for him, it's all made new. And it'd be hard. Chuck cared so deeply about how ideas impacted everyday people. And to see the victims of ideas, the victims that ADF cares about and takes care of in so many different ways, you know, he loved these people, and he understood that the ideas of the elite really create victims of people, you know, who really don't have a say in it because of the way culture works, because of the way social institutions work. And it would have been tough, I think, you know, for him. He always felt like he needed to do something for others. He talked about, you know, you might remember Saving Private Ryan being his favorite movie, and that wonderful scene, you know, did I live a good life? Gratitude being the queen of the virtues, as Chesterton said. That my gratefulness to God gives me responsibility for others. My gratitude to those who've gone before really is a calling for me to take care of others. And he certainly lived that out. But you know, I think he also would go back and say, you know, what matters? Life. That's what matters. What matters is God's creational design, male, female, marriage, lifelong married love, stabilizing the family. Of course, he saw the impact downstream in the prisons from the breakdown of the family upstream. Now when you have kind of an official breakdown of the family in law and an expansion of the family, replacement of the family, you know, all these things I think would have continued to be at the top of his list of things that the church needed to be engaged in. And I think that's the last thing I'll say is that he believed, and you know, I don't know if you do this. You kind of have Chuck's voice in the back of your head, right? If you've ever worked with him and the things that he said. And the one that I keep going back to is when he said, you know, what the world needs most is for the church to be the church. In other words, we sometimes want to say the answer's out there if they would only change. And really, we think about God establishing his church in Christ to be salt and light. It's our job. What are we doing? And you know, you knew better than anyone, Billy, that his passion for that ran high. What are we doing? Are we stewarding the opportunities and the gifts and the resources and the movement that God's placed us in? And I think he would be, as always, calling for the church to be the church.
Yeah. I know he would be so proud of the work that you're doing, and not just carrying on the ministry that he started, but encouraging people to pursue truth. And he talked a lot about your sphere of influence, like because sometimes people feel like they can't do it all. It's like, well, I'm not Chuck Colson. I'm not going to speak in stadiums in front of large crowds and stand next to James Dobson and Father Newhouse and those kinds of folks. It's like, what am I going to do? I'm a plumber in Tuscaloosa or something. It was like, but he was very encouraging that everybody does have a sphere of influence. Right. There are people that you can draw closer to God. You can be an evangelist and those kinds of things. What do you think has maybe changed, though, in modern times? Because there is this pushback that we now have from government. There's censorship where before you would hope that people would step forward and just put forth the effort to be a person of faith in the public square. Now, it's likely you'll pay a price for it somewhere along the way. What do you think's changed the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things that I did with Chuck was a speaking engagement, and there was somebody on the panel there talking, rightly so at the time, about cocktail party pressure. And what he meant is if you speak up amongst a group of friends about maybe one of these issues like abortion or something like that, you may not get invited back to the next cocktail party, and that's a very real pressure. I think that kind of the cocktail party pressure threats that we had 15, 20 years ago have turned into the sort of threats that are what we see with someone like Jack Phillips.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's one thing to be made fun of. It's one thing to be considered outdated and prudish and maybe even talked about like, you're misled and foolish, and that's hard to hear. It's another thing to hear that you're Hitler, you're evil, and we need to do something about you. We need to change your mind. That's
to set out to crush them.
I mean,
like
listen,
it's really aggressive.
That's what again, Jack is a friend, Phillips, and the person who's been going after him has basically said he needs to change his mind. I mean, and I will use the power of the state to do that. And that's just one of the examples now that we see. And so I think that's one of the things that's changed is that the stakes have become higher. Some people have talked about this kind of move into a more negative world. I think some of those kind of analyses need nuance, but it's true. Something's changed. Something has ramped up, and I think that's probably the biggest thing that has changed.
Where do you see the greatest hope then? Because we think about the issue of parental rights within the education system and even the healthcare system. We think about global censorship. We think about debanking, threats to life. Like we could go on and become very cynical and kind of cry into our drink. But where do you see the greatest hope?
Well, the greatest hope is that it's actually the things we believe are actually true.
And that helps, doesn't it?
No, yeah. I mean, but we forget that. I think it feels like, especially in a time of increasing cultural pressure, that we're playing on the enemy's turf. We're not. I mean, I understand culturally speaking, maybe we don't have home field advantage anymore. But this is my Father's world. Like, there's only one reality. There's still gravity. And the Christian story aligns with the way things actually are. And what that means is two things. Number one is we can appeal to the truth and the goodness of Christian truth. The second thing is that alternatives are eventually going to be exposed. Mm. And we're seeing some of that too, right? I mean, you think about in recent days, secular intellectuals looking back and say, actually Christianity was what brought all this good stuff to the world. And Christianity actually is the source of things like freedom and women's rights and children's rights and so on. And Christianity actually, wasn't the source of all the bigotry and intolerance that we hear. And so we're seeing some of that, I think, in intellectual circles. But that's the hope, is that Jesus Christ truly has risen from the dead. And so we don't think about being on, quote unquote, the wrong side of history in the way that we're told to by our opponents. We think about being on the right or wrong side of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who sits on the throne, and God has placed all things under His feet, like that. That's really where the hope is. T.S. Eliot put it this way. He goes, when we keep that in mind, then all the results are left up to him. For us, there's only the trying, he said, and the rest is none of our business. And in the short term, followers of Jesus throughout history have had to pay pretty steep prices. What's made their sacrifices and the challenges worth it is that they're part of a larger story.
Yeah.
And the story that is centered around Christ Jesus. And so, that's really where the hope lies.
You talked about, it was kind of a funny start because you said, well, we have the truth. I'm like, well, that's true. That actually is a good starting point, isn't it? Because if what you believe and all your efforts are predicated on a lie, it's inevitable that it'll fall. Yeah. And even if we take it out of the cultural realm, I remember the food pyramid. And now there isn't a nutritionist in the world that would say, yes, you should base 60% of your calories on carbohydrates.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's all changed.
It's that's how you could work yourself into diabetes. But that was every classroom in America was talking about that. Well, now we know that's not true. Smoking used to be advertised as a good anti-anxiety thing for pregnant women. I'm well, nobody is saying that anymore. So a lie only stands so long. I sometimes I feel like our job is almost to mitigate the damage of the lie before it inevitably crumbles upon itself. Yeah. And so when we're dealing with maybe gender ideology, there should be very few detransitioner stories. Mm-hmm. We should not allow that to happen. People are mutilating themselves, and kids being put on these hormones, and we're seeing all of the kind of the profit center that's becoming very common amongst the transgender ideology. And so our job is mostly to mitigate the decline of an obvious lie.
Mm-hmm.
We can only live in that posture for so long. I worry most for my kids and what their world's going to be like, because things have shifted so much in the last 30, 40 years. I think, boy, geez, what does 30, 40 years from now look like? When we first met, you were doing a lot of public speaking to youth groups, and I think that's kind of why Chuck brought you in initially to the Colson Center, was because you had this great perspective of young people. I remember you said something, I think about this regularly, and we haven't talked in a long time, so it's kind of funny to say that, but you had said that kids don't need the hip, cool youth pastor. They need grandpa with the tackle box.
Did I say that?
You did.
That's genius, man.
And I thought to myself, ain't that the truth? Yeah. Ain't that true? That timeless wisdom, and really you're pointing to the timeless truths of Christianity and our faith. What is your message now? If you're talking to either parents or to young people, what is it that this next generation needs to see when they don't have the wisdom yet, they don't have the experiences of life, and they haven't seen some of these lies crumble, and they might be a little vulnerable to it because it keeps them socially safe. Mm-hmm. It keeps them out of the crosshairs, and inevitably we try to dodge arrows. No one wants to take them, but we're kind of telling them you have to be authentically Christian and to be who we are. What is your message now to parents about kids, but then to kids themselves?
Well, yeah, the multi-generational message is still true, right? Which is kids need old people. They need to. They need that sort of intergenerational connection, and actually they're longing for it. I know that the biggest technological development in those years has been social media and little glowing rectangles in front of everyone's faces. It will not substitute. It cannot substitute for real people, and there's nothing that can actually substitute for family, for moms and dads. And when you think about the technological intervention between the families, you think about the state intervention within families, where state officials basically are saying, "I know better than you," and kind of trying to really usher the kid away from parental authority and parental influence. The number one thing that kids need is mom and dad, and then that extended family, those who have the most vested interest and care the most for them. And I know it's a struggle. I know it can feel like you're, beating the wind trying to get your kids' attention, but it's absolutely worth it. That's the first thing. Second thing I would say is, we can't take anything for granted. There were things, conversations we probably didn't need to have with our children. I mean, my oldest is just about to hit her second decade on the planet, or third decade, I guess, on the planet. And my youngest just about to, is still under the age of 10. And the differences between the two of them, the conversations I had to intentionally have with my oldest, and now I have to intentionally have with the youngest, it's changed. I can't take anything for granted. Things that were just kind of baked into the system the most obvious being that boys and girls are different. And here are boys and girls aren't interchangeable. And this is what it means to be a boy, and this is what it means to be a girl. And I would say to parents, make sure that we lay out all of what is true about who they are, about identity, and not assume that they're going to get that from anywhere else. Because not only are they not going to get it from anywhere else, they're actually going to get opposite messages on many of these issues. So, don't assume any shared knowledge. Don't assume anything. Work hard on it. And, I think a lot, too, about someone that I had the privilege of recently meeting, someone that Rod Dreher wrote about in 2 of his books, Kamala Benda. She was a woman who raised a family in the middle of communist Czechoslovakia in Prague, and was very clear about wanting her children to know what was at stake. And you think about our conversations that we have. Should I shield them from this? Should I expose them to this? And her idea was, you have to raise children to meet the challenges of the moment. So what happens here has to meet the challenges there. And a wonderful line there where she says that she would read Lord of the Rings, the series, to them over and over, because they needed to know that Mordor really existed and that it could be beaten.
Yeah. I just watched that series with my kids. The extended editions, The Lord of the Rings. I just watched it with my 3 older ones. My 1.5-year-old, I'll give her a couple years before she sees
the orcs are a little tough, right? Yeah. But think about that, because that series is all about that, isn't it?
Yeah.
But to think about, this isn't fantasy, it's myth.
Yeah.
Right? And Tolkien talked about...
Chesterton, too, talked about
we needed that true myth. That this is a way of thinking about the world out there. And for her and for her family, it was, that there are real enemies of your soul. There are real enemies of truth. There are real enemies of our family. And what does it look like to engage that with courage, but to do it the way that the Lord wants us to do it? And you just kind of look at that and say, okay, now that helps me realize what are the challenges of my moment, and what does it look like to parent in such a way that I'm preparing them to meet those challenges?
Yeah. One thing that the namesake for the Colson Center, Chuck Colson, was very dedicated to was bringing evangelicals and Catholics together. He actually started an organization called Evangelicals and Catholics Together.
Which still exists.
I know. Mm-hmm. But I think as I've looked through COVID, I think a lot of institutions within Christianity, Protestant and Catholic, kind of turned inward because they're all just trying to survive through a tough time. We've come out of it. And I don't see as much of the crossover and unity as we had then. I don't think it's overt. I think it's kind of accidental almost. But what role do you see in all the battles that we're fighting for parental rights and against gender ideology and for life and against censorship? We're all going to pay a price for these things. How can we better come together and be unified as a Christian people, as God's people, around these issues to seek out victories? I look at ADF, it's a very ecumenical environment. I'm a Catholic in an environment. I work with a lot of evangelicals and certainly a number of Catholics as well. It's extremely fluid. Like I'm actually, it's remarkable that I've not experienced any tension and things, which there would naturally occasionally be. And so I see it almost as a microcosm of what I would hope to happen elsewhere, that all these Christians come together from different backgrounds to achieve massive victories. Where do you see opportunities to do that out within the rest of Christianity?
I think about that work that Chuck did a lot as well. And a lot of that work does still continue kind of in these circles. And ADF is such an incredible example of the sort of ecumenism of the trenches, in a sense, that Chuck and one of his colleagues used to talk about. And there is a clarity that emerges, right, as the pressure increases. If you look, for example, across the evangelical world, any evangelical voice that has capitulated on issues of marriage or gender ideology or the abortion issue inevitably has also capitulated on the essentials of the faith, the truthfulness of Scripture, the authority of Christ, the exclusivity of Christ, the sinfulness of man, the substitutionary atonement. And these things very much are hand in hand. The historic creeds to which we all ascribe. One of the fascinating things, there are these fundamental beliefs. And if you have shifted on issues of anthropology, which ironically are not covered in the creeds. Right. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean male, female? And of course, the reason is the creeds emerged at a time when something had needed clarity. They needed that sort of clarification.
We need to know the fundamentals.
That's right. And there's usually somebody teaching something that's not true in the church going, oh, wait a minute, that's not right. And so let's call a council and let's issue a creed. It's almost as if the question of anthropology was never up in the air until today. But again, those who are offering a new heretical or heterodox anthropology and inevitably have already shifted on these other beliefs that are so clearly stated. And so I think there are these historic lines, and these lines exist for a reason because of things like the Reformation and things like some of these other historic moments of clarity about what it is that we believe as followers of Christ. And those lines still matter, but the challenges of our culture have given us clarity about what it means to hold fast to truth, and then who we find ourselves basically in the trenches with. I always love that phrase, ecumenism of the trenches. Mm-hmm. You realize if we're shooting in the same direction, we're on the same team.
Yeah.
And I think that work that Chuck did has borne an awful lot of fruit. And it's not nearly as remarkable today to see Catholics and evangelicals of a common mind on these fundamental truths of reality on the same team. And ADF is a great example of that.
Yeah, and you're right that when Chuck did it, it was kind of scandalous. Like, it split elements of the Christian world. And not all of your friends stick around when you make bold moves like that. And there was a price to be paid.
Listen, it's still a question for an awful lot of people, whether he did the right thing or whether he didn't. I have the privilege of still being a part of evangelicals and Catholics together today. And, I remember when it started, I was way young. I wasn't a part of any of it. I didn't know Chuck or anything like that, and heard various versions of it. It is hard work what they do. The rumor was it was a bunch of folks getting in the room together and compromising on things that they believed. And I can assure you what it is a group of people getting together, citing the creeds, saying the Lord's Prayer together, and then fighting in a good way, and hugging each other and going home, and 6 months later getting together again.
It's like boxers touching gloves at the start of a fight.
There is because there's really a lot of concern that that compromise doesn't happen. Mm. And I'm grateful for that work. We again remain committed to that work, and it's led to, I think, a lot of clarity on doctrinal issues. It's led to a lot of clarity on what it is that we actually believe versus the kind of the caricatures we say about each other. It also has led, I think, to important clarity on cultural issues. I think about the statement, for example, one of the most recent statements from ECT is the gift of children. Mm. And, you think about, you wouldn't think, do we need a theology of children? Well, you know what? 100 years ago, no. But we're now a culture and a church where a lot of folks have adopted technologies unwittingly without thinking through the ethics of them, and ways of thinking about the family as temporary, ways of thinking about children as optional, ways of thinking about men and women as interchangeable, and just kind of unwittingly just kind of embrace these values without ever kind of going back and saying, what does it mean to recognize God's created design in all these things? Mm-hmm. And gosh, how many of the issues that ADF champions and the lawsuits are around that issue, mm-hmm. right? Of anthropology, of male and female, of marriage, of children.
They're really the most fundamental issues. When I talk to my kids about having to take a stand, 'cause I'm trying to prepare them even at a young age that it's cold out there sometimes,
Right.
And the way I often frame it for them is you have to decide who you are. You don't just kind of evolve into who you are. It's really a series of decisions. And so when they come to a hard decision, especially if it's a moral one, I try to take that opportunity and say to them, this is a moment where you decide who you are, and then your behavior follows that. I think we live in a society where people feel like they're defined by their behaviors.
Yeah.
And so I try to reorient that with my kids. But I also think about that for people who have trouble taking a stand, whether it's at work, like they're worried about paying a price, and they're kind of going to like higher level decisions, when really the more fundamental decision is, well, who am I? Am I the person that gives in? Am I the person that denies my Lord? Am I the person that denies the truth or the obvious truth of just kind of natural truth and basic reason? And then at the most extreme examples, do I even deny my faith? And so I feel like you have to decide who you are. For those who are struggling with making that decision and fostering up the courage, what would you would say to them if you had a couple minutes on an elevator?
Yeah.
What would be your last pitch to say, please take a stand, please stand in the gap?
It's probably 10 years ago. I was speaking at a Christian college and had a wonderful nursing program, and a handful of the students had come up to me either prior to the event, and we were talking about the challenge of ethics. They were nursing students, and it just hit me what a great school this was, how much it cost for their parents to or for them to attend, the degree, the hireability they were going to have, and yet they were walking into a profession where at the time, and partially thanks to the good work of ADF, there's more robust conscience protections in that area, but who knows? And I said, it may be that you're going to drop $120,000, $150,000 on this education to get a great education and be ready to be hired. And the most important thing you will do in your life to follow Jesus is to get fired.
Yeah.
And you kind of go, that's a decision that Christians throughout history have had to make, to get fired from their position, from their social status, from their family, from their friends, from their existence, really. And others, we think about our brothers and sisters in Nigeria, for example. Right now they're making that decision day in and day out. I call it a theology of getting fired. And in America, we haven't really had to think these thoughts until more recently. We certainly don't have to think them with the same sort of urgency that some of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world have. And it is a different thing to make the decision between your faith in your life than your faith in your job. But that choosing between your faith and your job that's another challenge, between choosing between your faith and being made fun of or something like that. We're just in a new day, and we need to have thought that out beforehand. I love what you said about a lot of times it just kind of happens, and we let what happens to us then turn around and shape us, and we need to be more intentional.
Our natural inclinations aren't always good.
Yeah, really? Yeah. You shouldn't follow your heart?
It seems to be rare that I should follow my inclination.
Yeah. You go back to kind of one of the graphics that we use to talk about worldview and why it's important to have a Christian worldview. For a really long time, as you kind of think of a triangle, and at the base of that triangle is your worldview, what you believe about reality. And from that come your values, and from that come your behavior. Unfortunately, we live in a culture where a lot of people don't think deep thoughts about life in the world. They don't think about the decisions they have to make. We're told to follow our hearts and not actually think about whether our feelings are true or not. And so it's almost like we live upside down.
Yes.
Right? In other words, our worldview, we accept a set of behaviors because they're normal, and then that changes our values. So we say things like, well, we need to be tolerant and love everyone, and then that actually ends up changing what we believe.
Yeah.
That intentionality is absolutely huge. I think, by the way, the theology of getting fired is a way of thinking, okay, where is this line before I meet it? It's interesting, just even having the conversation yesterday with some ADF clients, and he's like, I never thought this would happen here. I never thought it would happen in my school district. I never thought it would happen to my child, and yet here we are. And, to make those decisions and say, here's the line, you know, and to cross this line is to, as you put it, deny my faith, and I can't do that. To cross this line is to abdicate my responsibility as a father or as a mother, and I can't do that. Being really clear and thinking that ahead of time, I think, is part of what it means to live in this cultural moment.
Yeah.
I think it's also important too, by the way, and that's why it's so important that ADF has done such a great job building that alliance. Yeah. And us being a part of that alliance, it allows me to bring, the pastors and the churches and the Christian schools and other groups that we work with into this orbit and to think of these thoughts. Because we've also then got to think, okay, if there's going to be, for example, a Barronelle Stutzman, a Jack Phillips, someone who pays significant long-term cost. Jack's been facing these challenges for 13 years now, right? 14 years. What's our responsibility to him?
Yeah.
If he's going to take these shots for all of us, he's going to lose a significant portion of his business. We often think about our faith in the dominant cultural terms, and the dominant force culturally in the West for a long time has been secularism. And secularism privatizes faith. That's what secularism does. And so we think about our faith as, what do I believe? What's true for me? Which is not the same as the fundamental claims of Christianity, which is Christ is Lord, right? And so we actually have to intentionally push back against our own secular impulses if we're going to get to this theology of getting fired. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We've got to actually push back and say, no, I think actually this is true. I think what Christianity tells us about what it means to be human, male and female, is not just true for me, but true with a capital T, as Schaeffer would say and Chuck would say. Then if that's true, then it requires something of me. And that's how you start working out with the sort of intentionality that you're talking about, the kind of faith we need to have that's capable of addressing the challenges that we may face.
It's almost like spiritual training. You have to affirm what's true. It's, my dad was in federal law enforcement for 26 years, and they would run drills and do certain things so that when the moment came, they weren't having to think about what they were doing. It was an instinctive reaction to they knew what was coming and they knew how they respond, and that saves lives and it can save souls too.
So dear friend Larry Taylor, who leads ACSI, Association of Christian Schools International, I know also an alliance partner with ADF, he brought this verse to my attention years ago in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, if you can't run with the foot soldiers, how are you going to race with the horses?
Ooh, that's great.
Isn't that a great line?
That's really good.
And basically, he said the level of practice has to meet the level of competition. And he, of course, is challenging Christian schools. Like, if you're going to raise these kids, help parents raise these kids, teach them a Christian worldview, it's got to be up to par. I live in Colorado Springs, so we see these Olympic athletes. Listen, you don't train for the Olympics by playing pickup in the park.
Yeah.
Right? Your level of training has to match the level of competition you're going to face. That's half the reason people train out in Colorado Springs, because there's no oxygen out there. And so, you're basically trying to up the game. And we don't always do that as parents, as pastors discipling our people. And say, look, this is the level. We need to be kind of sober-minded, clear-eyed about the level of challenge out here, so that our discipleship and preparation and grounding in the gospel can meet that challenge.
We're out of time, and I don't want to hold you up, but if you could just tell people, where can they learn more about Colson Center and the work you're doing?
Yeah, you can find us. The best place to find us is breakpoint.org. Of course, Breakpoint's the flagship commentary that Chuck started years ago, talking about the culture and connecting it within the eternal truths of a Christian worldview. And then you can also find that on wherever you download your podcast. That's the best place to start.
Perfect. John, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.